I think it's fair to say that adventure-style mountain bikes are generally perceived to be hardtails or short travel or gravel-style bikes, ones that are good for nothing apart from, say, a forest track or a badly maintained road, which are plentiful in the UK or through the middle of LA. But where do long travel mountain bikes sit when it comes to big mountain adventures? And what would you choose between a 160 and a 180 in that kind of environment? Recently, we teamed up with White to do a pretty adventurous trip from North Wales to South Wales, all off-road. 12-hour days, 5 figures of climbing each day and super high mileage. Now, the trip began with a brace of bikes, an E160 and an E180. And after many days of getting involved in Wales's finest and oldest geology, we spilled out on the Welsh Riviera after 4 days on the hammer. So, on the subject of what was the best tool for the job, which bike wetted our whistle the most? Was it the session style bike, slightly lighter, slightly less full body, but still flavoursome 160? Or can the big hitter, the 180, go the distance on monster days out? Yes, it was an incredibly hard trip for both bike and rider. And one question that we were continually asking, and also one which you guys asked as well, is what bike is best for such a trip? So, two incredibly capable bikes, but with very different personalities. And as White described them, the E160S, rider-focused, a do-it-all British bulldog trail bike that packs more punch into every ride. And then the E180 RS, rider-focused, full gas, a self-shuttling enduro bike. Now you could, I suppose, build a picture in your mind of the character and personality of each of these bikes through White's description. But let's begin by having a look at the vital statistics. So, the White E160 RS, a trail enduro style bike as White put it. 65-degree head angle, 75-degree seat-tube angle, 442mm chainstay, and a 330 bottom bracket and 480mm reach in size large. And the heavy hitter, the E180 RS, a gravity enduro style bike as White put it. Now this time we have got a 64-degree head angle, a 75-degree seat-tube angle, a 444mm chainstay and a 335mm bottom bracket with a 480mm reach on the size large, which is the same as the E160. So a degree or a millimetre here or there, but ultimately they're pretty similar. A closer look and you'll see there are many other similarities, but in as much as they are characterised differently, the reality is both bikes share many characteristics. A 38mm fork, an all-alloy chassis, 27.5-inch wheels front and back, the gearing, the Bosch motor, and the 625 watt-hour battery. There is, however, a £1,000 difference between the 180 and the 160, and that's largely down to more expensive parts. The question is, are they worth it? So the the two bikes very close in terms of angles and very similar in terms of the componentry attached to them. But what's the reality of the ride? How do they perform when you're out in the mountains? Well, on our North South Wales adventure, we did a load of technical climbing. We did a ton of really savage descending, and we did a load of single track and quite a bit of double track. We also did a bit of carrying. In fact, we did a load of carrying. We also had to deal with wet route, very wet route, and World Cup standard descents. Yes, it was a route that really asked for everything out of rider and a bike. I want to highlight now the key differences between the two bikes. On the 160 bike, we have a Fox Float 38, 160mm travel, 27.5, 3-position adjust, a custom tune and a grip damper with a 44mm offset. And on the 180, yes, you guessed, 180mm travel, but again, a Fox 38mm fork with a Grip 2 damper, custom tune e-bike, a lot more adjustment on the compression and rebound, but Kashima coating. Now, on the rear of both these bikes, first of all, the 160 bike, we've got a Fox Float Performance DPS Evol LV. Crikey, that's a lot of words, isn't it? Anyway, it's, as you can see, it's a smaller chamber on this bike than the 180, but it does have adjustment in compression and rebound. Now, on the 180 bike, as you can see, an extra volume. There's a bigger damper on this bike, and it's the Fox Float Factory X2 on here with independently adjustable compression and rebound. But the key thing, the old Kashima coating. So yes, it's still a 38mm fork on both bikes with the same offset and just a bit more travel, but importantly, damper and coating differences. And also the tune of each shock on the rear will be different. In very basic terminology, it will either provide a harder or a softer ride character. Sensitivity, support, and therefore steering and control will be affected to a certain degree. And out the back, a more sophisticated shock too. So obviously, having planned the route from north to south, I knew the route reasonably well. So I was able to choose the hard moments and the easy moments in terms of what bike I chose. So I had a cunning plan. On the single track, I'd use the 160 bike, whereas when I was on the super hard downhill sections, I'd be using the 180. Because let's face it, it's not so many years ago that World Cup downhill racing was won on 180mm travel bikes. Now the wheels, the rims, the spokes and the tyres will also have an effect on the riding character of the both bikes. And here I am with the 160, and I have to say we had some great times on some very varied terrain. As I mentioned, 27.5 wheels, front and rear on both bikes. On the 160, we've got some WTB rims. Now, they're not any old WTB rims, and I have to pick my phone up for some reference here. We actually have the WTB HTZ i30 TCS 2.0 system, asymmetric, sleeve joint, super tough construction, tubeless ready, and 32 hole. Whereas on the 180 bike is actually DT wheels on there, and they're 28 spoke wheels. So that's going to have a huge impact on the riding character on both bikes just on the wheels. Okay, the rubber. Now, fortunately for us, we had two of my favorite tires on this trip, an Assegai and a Maxxis Minion DHR2. Now, there's an Assegai fitted to both the 160 and the 180 bikes up front, whereas on the rear, the 180 bike has got the Assegai and the 160 has got the Minion DHR2. So, a slightly more aggressive compound on the Assegai will contribute, together with the wheel set, to a different ride characteristic on the 180 and the 160, and also on the rolling resistance as well. This would all suggest then that the E160 will have a tighter, livelier ride for the long days on single track and a more comfortable bike for adventure style riding. Which is true to a degree. The E160 feels tighter and stiffer than the 180, and there is a reason for this. Less travel, slightly more progressive suspension, a more basic damper front and rear, and don't forget the different spoke count might come into it too. The The E180 simply feels softer. Common sense, right? It's got more travel. Not much, but enough. Softer suspension, well, certainly more expensive suspension front and rear, a larger volume air can on the back, and less spokes in the wheels. So hopefully I'm building up a picture now of how the two bikes ride very differently, because the dynamic ride of a mountain bike is affected by so many things. The dampers, the tune to those dampers, the coatings on the fork and the shock, the rim width, the spoke count, the grip of the tyres all affect how the bikes handle. But remember, there is still a 20mm difference between the two bikes as well. Which kind of brings us back to where we started, and White's description of both bikes is pretty accurate. But which bike is the best for big days out? Well, the 180 will climb technical terrain as efficiently as the 160, and also it's got roughly the same range. But what do you guys think? Would you go for a 180 or a 160? Well, I'll tell you what we thought, because it was actually the 180 that we reached for. Both of us, we were fighting over this bike later in the days of, quite significant amount of riding, and that's because it was more comfortable. It probably was due to the softer suspension, but this actually goes against everything that is said about the ultimate bike for adventure riding. So guys, 180 versus 160, let us know what you think, because now we're back in the forest and maybe shorter, snappier rides, I'm kind of leaning more towards the 160.